Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
George Halas, who recently retired as coach of the Chicago Bears, was a spectator at the game and had a few words to say about one of his former players.
Red Grange joined us immediately after his last collegiate game against Ohio State, and he played his first pro game on Thanksgiving Day of 1925. He was probably the most publicized player of all time, and yet he always conducted himself in a modest manner. He gave pro football the impetus that it needed so badly in 1925. I would really say that he was a maker of professional football because of what he added to us. And with it all, the size of his hat always remained the same. He was one of the finest personalities I've known. A fine, honest, modest young man. And today, he is still of the same type, I'm happy to say.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
And welcome to the 55-yard line here tonight with Scott and Greg, where we welcome Chris Willis, noted professional football historian and the head of the NFL Research Library. Chris is the author of numerous books, including biographies of Joe Carr, Red Grange, Dutch Clark, and soon, for us Chicago Bears fans, Bronko Nagurski. Welcome, my friend. I had the pleasure of meeting you several years ago while you were in Chicago promoting your book on Red Grange, and it is great to see you again and to talk about your career as both a writer and as a member of what I consider the greatest team, as a member of the greatest film studio on earth.
No, thanks, Greg, for having me. The Red Grange little tour a couple years ago was nice to enjoy and to get his story out there. So it's good to reconnect and talk a little bit more football history.
Speaking of football history, I kind of like origin stories. So I was wondering, what's your origin story as far as you started out as a football fan, but when did you become a fan of the history of football?
That's a good question. I always, think back of, what happens. I think a couple things I was fortunate, growing up. One was that I was born in Ohio, and Ohio is sort of the hotbed of a lot of football, crazies. And so that helped out. And then my dad owned a used bookstore. So growing up, reading books. I sort of gravitated to the sports section, for some reason, and sort of started reading any books on football, and football books are really cheap to buy. You can go to a dollar bin and used bookstore or whatever, you can find it. So growing up, that sort of led me to read about a lot of the history and the players and the teams and things like that. So and then as I got a little bit older, we were from Columbus, so we were 2 hours from the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So in high school and definitely in college, I started, making trips there and going to the induction ceremonies and stuff like that. So it kind of snowballed from reading and things like that, and just absorbing, the history of the game. And, like I said, there's a lot to be written about, history. I think pro football history, there's still a lot of untapped stories, that can be written about and needs to be told. But, like I said, it was just really nice to be able to absorb some of that, growing up and stuff. So that's sort of how I got my start.
Was it just football, or did you have an interest in the history of other sports as well?
I pretty much stuck to football. Like, baseball was the predominant one. And if you're a fan of sports, there's certain layers, I think, for each sport, and like golf and boxing and baseball, there's a lot more sort of literary it sort of gives its way to the written word, where as much as I love football, it's more of a visual sport. And, I worked for NFL Films, and for 50 years, people want to watch football. It's a little tougher to get a mass audience to read about football, where baseball and golf and boxing kind of leads sort of to those stories, but football, like I said, you can learn a lot by reading, but like I said, for the most part, it's a visual. But so growing up and being part, like football was sort of dominant, like I am a big sports fan. Baseball, I like watching baseball. I'm a Reds fan from Ohio. I like watching golf and tennis, so I like the big sporting events. I like sports, but my passion is football and sort of absorb in anything I can, whether it's college or NFL or pro.
And when you were, growing up, I mean, like you, I spent a lot of time reading, and that's where my love of football started. Who were some of your favorite authors growing up? I mean, for me, George Plimpton obviously was probably, for a lot of us, he was a big influence. Though I got to say, I enjoy the movie much better than I enjoy the book, but because the book did not have Lauren Hutton in it, whereas the movie did. But who were your favorite sports authors?
Wow, that's a good one. I think some of the guys that I got in, I mean, obviously with the NFL, I mean, first was more of a sports writer, not a maybe author or historian, was Paul Zimmerman, Dr. Z. Like if you read Sports Illustrated, which now is more online, it's not even weekly anymore, but in the late 70s and 80s and 90s, like it was huge to get Sports Illustrated, or Pro Football Weekly, and those guys who published that. But Dr. Z was the main writer for Sports Illustrated, so he'd cover the games, he'd make his predictions. The sports preview was always something you must read and you must buy when it came out, and so he was he's one of them. But I would say the biggest influence on me, or sort of the one that I liked the best and sort of gravitate to, was Richard Whittingham. And Richard Whittingham, wrote a lot of pro football books in the 80s when I was really starting to get more. He wrote the Illustrated History of the Chicago Bears, Dallas Cowboys, which I still read. What a game they played. And it was published in 1984. And because he did the thing that I would have loved to have done, if I was born, maybe 15, 20 years earlier. And what a game they played is he interviewed about 20, 22 players, all-time greats, like Red Grange, it was Don Hudson, it was Shipwreck Kelly, Joey Sternament, like it was all Wellington Mara, because all these guys were still alive, in the early 80s and mid 80s. And it's an oral history book, and it's really quick chapters, and it's really great to read because these are the guys that lived it. These are the guys that started the league that, like I said, I love today's game, but just the fascination of the 20s and 30s and how we got started and how the game survived and how it grew, how it really was like the 10th best sport on the totem pole, in the 1920s, 1930s. I mean, it's even behind wrestling and horse racing and tennis. And then it grew to what it is today. So that book and what Richard Whittingham, what he wrote and some of his stories, like I said, especially with those oral history books, was some of the first sort of books. And another series you guys are probably familiar with was the Punt, Pass, and Kick series, which, some of the older writers, Xander Hollander and Jack Claret and some of those guys wrote, which was a series of books that were just sort of, they were geared more towards younger audience, but they just had the history, they had photos, and they were so easy to read, and you could just sit there and just plow through them, and you can go back to them and read them again because they're entertaining. Those series of books were like some of the ones that I gravitated towards and still even enjoy today.
Well, I mean, when we were in school, if you remember, every month we had that scholastic order form that came in, and during the autumn period, were you like me when around autumn time, I mean, checking all the football books that came out? I mean, I've got a stack of them in my reading room that my wife looks at with disdain because she's like, those are kids' books. I'm like, yeah, but they're the NFL fun book is one that I credit, for my love of football, really my deep love of football, which I think came out when I was in the 5th grade. So, and in talking about discovering books, I first really discovered you when I read your book on Joe Carr. And I knew your name when I saw it, but I had never read one of your books. When I read your Joe Carr book, and I've told you this on a few occasions, I was hooked. I mean, it is I think one of the best football books out there. And, Scott, yours is one of the best football books out there too.
no comparison though with this. I mean, the Joe Carr thing to me, a lot of times if you just think of the NFL and you think of commissioners, you're going to automatically think of Burt Bell and Pete Rozelle. But then when I started reading this book, and seeing everything he did, I mean, this guy had every angle covered. I mean, you don't have Joe Carr, you don't have the NFL as we know it. We're talking about some other professional football league.
I'm a little biased, but yeah, I agree. He's so underrated in the development of the sport. Like I said, especially with some of the pioneers. I mean, and albeit they should get credit. The George Houses, the Wellington Tamaras, the Art Rooneys and the Burt Bells, like they should all share credit. But for Joe Carr to be the one that sort of stood above them, so to speak, like he was the one that was in charge. He's the one that made the final decisions, and he sort of guided the sport. Like I said, I think he's so underrated, and it was just such a privilege, being from Columbus, and Joe Carr was a Columbus native. Like it meant a lot more. And like I said, I wanted to tell his story along with the NFL story from the 20s and 30s. It's a really good volume if you want to learn about what was going on during those first 2 decades. And but to explain his story from his viewpoint, from his eyes, like I said, it just was a privilege to do that and to accomplish that. And like I said, I enjoy people saying, because like I said, a lot of people don't know what he did and how he guided the sport. And so I always feel a little sense of, hey, you know what, if people read it and they get that understanding and they get to know a story, then like I said, it makes me feel like I did my job, as well as I could. So that's still, like I said, out of all my projects, that one and the Grange one are like 1 and 1A. So I although it's been about, was it now 11 years since that book came out? Then it came out in paperback a couple of years ago. It's still one of my favorites. Like it's still, like it still touches me. Like to tell his story and to talk about him and stuff and that people sort of still respond to that. So and because the other thing about, once I read that, and that's the thing with that era, is like a lot of the issues that he faced, that I covered, telling the story, is all the stuff that they face today. Like some of these issues people think, whether it's player movement, stadium issues, publicity, with getting people out to the games, ownership, like all the stuff that, statistics, which they started, the record and fact, but like all those things that we look at now, like, wow, the NFL has to face the issues. Like, well, about 90% of it they faced in the 20s and 30s. It's just at a different level. It was not at the $1 billion level. It was not at the exposure, the Super Bowl. Like, they created the draft, they created the championship game. Well, that was all that. Everything that the NFL sits on now was built during those 2 decades. And like I said, so his story, like I said, hopefully can continue to resonate with the history, of the league and stuff. So.
Hi, I'm Oz Davis of the True the Goats podcast here at the Sports History Network. I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
Well, talking about that, just even using, because we're a Canadian Football League podcast, but we cover both sides of the border. But in reading that Joe Carr book, a lot of the issues he was dealing with back then, the CFL is dealing with now. So, and I always tell people history matters. And especially, we all love professional football. And in the last, 6 months, I've encouraged a lot of people to go back and read those books, read your book and see what people dealt with, got almost 100 years now in terms of building the sport and expanding the sport. And when you were writing that book, and that book is a great history book too, not just a football book, but a history of the times. When you sat down to write it, what was your, I guess, not so much your research process, but kind of where was the starting point for you? We'll use Joe Carr, this one. What was your starting point to begin your research?
Well, most projects, usually start at the beginning. Like I really want to go back as far as I can. I guess, and especially with biographies, I think most biographers will tell you that, so the main thing for me that I sort of benefited, and like I said, I thank them all the time, was that the Carr family sort of opened their doors to me, at that time when I was doing the research, starting in like 2002 is when I actually met one of the grandsons of the Carr family, James Carr, who actually wrote the foreword for the book, and which I was doing the Columbus Panhandle stuff at that time, so I knew I wanted to write about Joe Carr. That was always in the back of my mind, like I want to tackle him. Nobody's ever written a full-length book or hardly anything on him, let alone a book, there's hardly any articles. And so that was the key to me, was like, and sometimes with a lot of these projects, starting with the family's input, just because you get so much more access and material and just a little more insight than if you didn't get that help, so that was a key for me, was like, okay, starting with the family, then they can tell me where he came from and where he lived and what he did and those type of things, as much as they could. Obviously most of them weren't living when he was around. So with biographies, like I said, I'm always wanting to find as much as I can, like I said. Now, maybe those first chapters aren't super in depth about the family and about this stuff, but I get a picture of who he is and what they did and where they came from. Because that was the same thing, not to branch off the Grange, was the same way. I was like, I want to know what he did, where he was, and, as much as I could,
Right.
Sometimes you can write a little bit more, but sometimes you can't. So, and then, like I said, it's digging into every area. The car one, for example, had, it's his story, and I'm sort of doing it from his viewpoint, but there was like 100 different roads going in different directions, because you would start with car. Then, okay, wait a minute. In 1925, he goes to New York and he recruits Tim Mara to buy the Giants and invest in NFL. Well, now you got to go over here to see what Tim Mara was like. What was he doing in New York in 1925? What was New York like in 1925? So that was the challenge of the book project. Was that one led to so many different avenues, because I wanted to cover it. I wanted to cover Burt Bell. I wanted to cover, was there any stadium issues? Was there attendance issues? Was there, what was George Halas doing? So there were so many avenues that you have to go down, to research, where maybe some other projects, are a little bit narrower, so, but no, I like to find, I don't know if I answered your question quite as well, but I just try to find as much as I can about the person or a team or the event and stuff, and try to find as much as I can. Because like you guys have read probably a decent amount. Some of your audience has, some of your audience hasn't. There's some people that will read Joe Carr and will know, okay, I know some of the story, or I didn't know this part. But there'll be some that might not know any of it. And then they're just like, okay, wow, this is all really good. I did not know that the league was doing it and Joe Carr was doing it. So, so you try to find what you can to tell the best story.
And, talking about that, I was talking to another podcaster, young guy, 25. He's got Gridiron Gallery podcast. He's starting new in the business. And we were talking about, but history, and he's learned. I mean, it's amazing now how many young kids are in their 20s now are just starting to kind of learn the history of the game, especially the ones that are getting into broadcasting. And we got to talking, and, I mentioned, if you have to, he goes, well, where do we start at? If I'm going to read about the history of the league, and he really, and he's like, I go, well, read Joe Carr's book. Start with there, because that really essentially more or less starts at the beginning. There's other books that start, at the Columbus Panhandle's book. It starts at the beginning. But that Joe Carr book sets the stage for everything that happens after.
I agree. And that was a little bit of the plan, when I went it, like I said, I wanted to keep it like a biography and do it from his viewpoint, but I also wanted to tell the story, because I didn't think there was as many volumes out there that covered the 20s and 30s as much, like when I tell people, like you said, you get a question like, well, there's so much that can be read, or what do I do? What's the best I might, and I always steer them to a couple things. I think Pigskin by Robert Peterson is a very good single volume. If you just want to, probably, I would say more than just a touching glance, but you get it more succinct. It's a more succinct volume of how the game grew from, college football in 1869 with Rutgers, Princeton, and where you get to the World War II or 1950. And then, like you said, I think Joe Carr fills that gap between the 20s and 30s. And then you have, obviously, America's Game by Michael McCain kind of picks up around the World War II, and Burt Bell's sort of coming in the scene and covers the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the growth all the way up to, when that book was published, about a decade ago, or 12, 15 years. So, so there's a couple of volumes there, and then you get a good sense of, hey, you read those three books, you have a lot of sense of what the NFL was like, or what pro football was like from the very start to what we see, kind of today and stuff. So, like I said, the plan was to tell Joe Carr's story, but also to say, hey, this fills a gap of being able to learn a little bit about, even if you just read, broken down chronologically, even if you just read like the presidency, which is like part 2 of the entire book, you just read like the last 200 pages, you get a good sense of maybe what the NFL was like and what it went through. And you didn't even really have to read about, his growing up and his panhandle days, or you just want that, then you could crank that out and understand it. So,
but there's such a romance to it. And that, when you start reading your book, I mean, he was such an interesting person, just regardless, and football aside. I mean, he was just an amazingly interesting man.
Yeah, I wish I mean, the book's pretty detailed and intense, but I didn't even really touch on some of the other stuff, like I said, because if you read the introduction, I said this is a football story, like he was involved in Major League or minor league baseball. He was one of the early, organizers of the American Basketball League, which turned into pro basketball, turned into the NBA, and he did a lot of other things, that was very creative and sports minded, and his sports writing. Like I go back and I touched on a little bit of his, like he was at the 1919 World Series. He covered the Black Sox World Series. He covered the Jack Dempsey fight. Like I want to dig deep and find even more of some of the sports writing. Like I barely touched on that, just because, like I said, it took up more pages, and all of a sudden it becomes a 600-700 page volume and stuff. So, there's a lot of things that he was involved in, and that makes him such an interesting, like I said, to me, sort of an unsung hero, of sort of sports executive pioneer. You could put him up there with like Branch Rickey and those type of guys that came along and sort of made being a sports executive their career and had that type of impact and stuff. So, like I said, he's so underrated in my mind.
And how about another great book you wrote was the book on Dutch Sternin. Tell us, we have a lot of people who are Lions fans, and I know we've got a few younger Lions fans. Explain because I couldn't explain to them fully why Dutch Sternin matters so much. Tell us why, tell us about that book and how that came to be, and really the impact he had not only in the Lions, but also the NFL.
Yeah, that one actually came out of the blue because I'm always thinking a year, 2-3 years ahead of time. It's just how I'm built. So I'm thinking of like there's probably like 10 projects on my mind right now, but am I going to do all 10? Probably not. So, because some of these books take, like 2 to 3 years to complete, but that one sort of came out of because I had just finished Joe Carr, and that was kind of my first trilogy. I call it, was kind of Star Wars. The first, I did Old Leather, which was an oral history book, which kind of like said was a homage to Richard Whittingham. Like I wanted to do something like that. Then the Panhandles was my hometown NFL team that sort of nobody knew about, with the Nesser brothers, and Joe Carr was the manager of that team. And then Joe Carr biography was the third one. So I was kind of like, well, what do I do next? I'm going to do, I was thinking maybe Camp Bulldog's book or, something like that. And all of a sudden, Dutch Clark just hit me for some reason. I was like, you know what? Nobody knows about Dutch Clark. He's a great player. He was a charter member of the Hall of Fame. And what kind of sealed it to me was, just like with the car, I tracked down the Dutch Clark family, and he had 2 sons and 2 stepsons that were living. So, and the big thing about it, what made it so unique was especially the 2 sons. The first son was like in his 70s, and then the other son was like early 50s. And I was like, wow, what happened here? Why is there a big difference between? Well, what happened was he married his high school sweetheart, and she unexpectedly passed away. So he remarried, had 1 son later, which was Tim Clark, and then 2 stepsons. Well, they're all were still living. So when I talked to them, I got like different perspectives. Like the oldest son had a lot of his early life, knew what he went through, and then the later son had all like his later life and what he went through with his coaching and some of his experience there. So as soon as that happened, they said they had scrapbooks, they had things that I could use. And like, as soon as I heard all that, I was like, well, I want to do this. Like, they're willing to cooperate. It's a story I want to tell. Like, nobody knows who he is. And him, unlike some other projects or even just articles I've written or researched for NFL Films, sometimes, especially with these early players, because there's not as much footage of these early players, that their write-ups in the newspaper made them maybe bigger than what they were. Like, oh, how great they were, or oh, wow, you know what? He was really written about like he was God. But, when you look at the stats or look at the games or what was his impact on the games, did he, how was he scoring? What was he doing? They don't maybe match up quite as much. But when I started digging into Dutch's life and his career, it was the exact opposite. Like his impact on the game, especially scoring, like blew me away. Like it was bigger impact and a much better player than I ever thought he was. Like, and that's the reason why I think the book came out that way, was like, wow, he was much better, whether it was from other players talking about him or, like, especially in the time he played in the early 30s, scoring was like a huge thing, and scoring. And he was the best scorer, whether it was kicking, running touchdowns, playing defense, than anybody during that time. And I was very impressed. I was like, wow, he impacted a lot of games. There's some players you look up, and you're like, wow, his touchdowns really didn't matter as much, he scored 7 touchdowns, but they all came in blowouts or against weaker opponents. But Dutch's performances against good opponents in big games, where he was like the one person that defenses needed to stop, like, was so impressive. And like I said, I was sort of blown away once I started going through his career. Like, wow, he was a really good player. And then, like, just 2 years ago, like, I was so happy that he was elected to the NFL's 100th all-time team, because I thought he by far might have been the best running back in the first, like, 25 years of the NFL. Like, if you gave me a choice, he might be number one, and, Fritz Pollard was great. Even guys like Patty Driscoll that were sort of quarterback / running back, Jimmy Collins, really up until almost Steve Van Buren, like, he might've been the best running back in the first 25 years of the NFL. So I, like I said, my research sort of led me to, like, wow, he was a much better player or a greater player than I thought he was. So.
One of my favorites, I've always been a Jim Thorpe fan. So the Walter Lingo, Jim Thorpe, and the Oorang Indians. I just want to hear you talk about that, because that's such a great story. And there's something to me about the barnstorming days of the NFL that's just terrific. I mean, it's amazing how many games these guys played in such a short period of time.
Yeah, that was another project. Like I mentioned before, I'm always thinking like 5 or 6 projects ahead. That one I always thought I would come back to. I think I did some interviews in Leroux in 2000 with the son of Walter Lingo. And then there was a guy named William Guthrie who actually played high school football at Leroux High School. And they practiced on the same field as the Oorang Indians with Thorpe. And he was still living. He was like 93 years old. And he was still living. He had these great stories. And so that was 2000. And that book didn't published in 2017. So I always thought that I would revisit that. And eventually, once I got through Dutch Clark and then the 49er book, I was like, you know what, I'm doing Oorang. That's what I would like to do. And so, like I said, that was so much fun to do, because the best thing for me, like, it was only 2 years. As much as I like to do guys who play 10 years and, 15 years or something like that, it was so much fun because it was only condensed to 2 years. So I was like, I put a lot of effort into just those 2 years to find out what I could find. And they played a lot of games. Like I said, they only played one game in Marion, everything else they barnstormed. Like I said, they were traveling. And that's another fun thing to do, is because the NFL was so young at that time, to see how they were perceived in different cities. They would go to, as big as Chicago. They played outside of Baltimore, but then they also played in, Dayton and Columbus. That they went to played in Minneapolis. Then they played non-NFL teams in like East Lansing and Indianapolis. So yeah, it's so much fun. Because one thing I like, especially with Twitter and social media and the internet now, like, images are so cool to look at now. And you see it on Twitter. You're on Twitter, and just to see old ads and old photos, especially from the 20s, it is so cool to see. And so any type of Oorang ad that had their sort of advertisement with Jim Thorpe and, and stuff like that, they're always so cool to see. So that was, like I said, I enjoyed that research probably just as much as some of the other ones, is because it's an era in a store, like I said, you're dealing with an adult kennel owner. And so even to go through some of that time period and just to see how big, because technically his dog kennel was bigger than the NFL. His ads and his advertising for the dog kennel was so much bigger than what he did for the football team. Although the football team gave him good publicity, it was just so much fun to venture into that and to see what the NFL was going. Like now we take it for granted, a team travels and you see the advertisements of the NFL team, when, the schedule comes out, everybody knows every game, but back in the 20s, it's really cool to see, some of those ads and how they presented themselves, whether it was photos and things like that presents. And that Oorang project was so much fun to do that. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites because, now you think of how teams and leagues market themselves. And that's what was so fun to me is this, it was a dog kennel. It was a football team. It was cross promotion and it was brilliant. I mean, it was just brilliant the way the whole thing was organized.
And it put butts in the seats, from what I understand.
Yeah. They actually did pretty well. Their crowds were pretty intensive. I mean, obviously, when you look at 7,000 or 8,000, that doesn't sound a lot. But back then, when the NFL was only averaging like 2,500 fans, to go to a game with Jim Thorpe and Oorang Indians and you get 7,000. I mean, it's more than almost triple what they were really looking at. So it made a big impact. They were one of the more popular teams in the first 20 years of the NFL. So.
And following on that, and talking about the growth of the NFL, as Randy Snow said to me one time, in the last month, Chris Willis's opus, the Red Grange story, the Red Grange book, and that's if anybody here is listening who has not read it yet, there's a lot of research. It's a really big book, and it's an amazing book. It covers everything. I've read other books on Grange, but yours tells kind of like Paul Harvey used to say here in Chicago, the rest of the story. And how long did it take you to write that book?
Well, that one, no, I'm glad you brought that up. That's as much as the car took a long time.
Right.
The Grange one, I could say it was almost two parts. The first part was I started that in pretty much in 1998. So you're talking 20 years of gathering things, not knowing that I was probably going to write it. But I think deep down in the back of my mind, especially once I started writing some articles and then I started doing book projects, I always knew that I wanted to do Grange. He was my favorite old time player. So starting in 1998 with the first big eBay, eBay was just starting to boom in 1998. And so I would, back then it was hard to find a lot of things, especially on early pro football and like Grange. So I sort of collected and sort of bought whatever I could on Red Grange, 20 years ago. And then I could collect, could find, whether it's articles, magazines, programs, tickets, photos, whether it was advertisement, it was Hollywood, whatever, I just started trying to find that stuff. So, so as I was starting to get through, some of the book projects, what kind of hit me, is probably the third time, probably a broken record now, is I'm always thinking ahead, like different projects. Well, my mind started thinking of, oh wait, do I want to do Grange, or when is that going to happen? And then probably right around Dutch time, I knew that the NFL was celebrating its 100th season in 2019. So once that hit, once I started thinking about that, I'm like, wow, that'll be the perfect time to do it. Like if it comes out, it could come out, because publishers and editors always looking for a nice hook, a good selling point. They like to, as much just to preserve the history, and that's my main goal, is to preserve football history. They want to sell some books too. So once I started thinking about that, I'm like, wow, that gives me enough time. So this was probably 2014, 2015. I was like, what if I can if it comes out in 2019, then it gives me enough time to do the book, So the research probably took close to 20 years, like, because I was collecting a lot of things, and because there's a lot of things I didn't have to go get once I committed to the project. But it took me about 2.5 years to do the research and then write it, which is normal, on average between 2 and 2.5 years for me to do a book project. So, but the Grange thing, I mean, you said it's an opus, but that was the plan all along. It wasn't like I accidentally went to that. The plan was to tell his complete story, because as much as I I love football, but there's not a lot of like in-depth sort of, especially about early players and coaches and owners like Joe Carr. And I always thought, why does Babe Ruth get 500 or 600 pages? Why does Ty Cobb, why does, Mickey Mantle, or why does, all these great athletes, or, whether it's Bobby Jones or, Wilt Chamberlain or whatever, like, why did they get 500 pages? Why can't Red Grange? Like, he's the first superstar of the NFL. He's probably the biggest name. If you know any early pro football player, it's going to be Jim Thorpe or Red Grange. That's it, until like Jim Brown or John, until you get to the 50s. Like, people probably don't know Sammy Ball quite as much, So I always thought, if I'm going to write it, then I'm going to write it, I'm going to write the most detailed biography. Like, if I'm going to spend time doing this, I want to do it right, and I want to do it at the level, like, I don't know if like Jane Levy wrote a Babe Ruth biography that came out like 2 years ago, and it was real deep. It was like 550 pages. It was super detailed, and I'm like, that's what I wanted to do for Grange. Like, it was a no-brainer for me. And the big thing about it is, it was actually, I had to cut like 75 to 80, 80 pages out of the manuscript too. So it is detailed and it's pretty thick, but it could have been much thicker. Like my editor, who was great, she's great for all my projects. She was like, it can't be 600 pages. It's, like it could be in between 5 and 6, but it just can't be 600 pages, Chris. So we kind of had to scale back some, and but that was, if you want to know, like, that was the plan all along. I didn't just run it, or I'd like to write to be writing, because most of the time I don't want it to be that long, But Grange was a different story. I was like, what? I want to do a detail. I want to, because there was, like you mentioned, there was a few volumes that already had been written about him, and I thought some of them really come up short, especially in some of his career, because a lot of times they would go to his last football game and then they would stop. Like, he lived to when he was, was 87 years old when he passed away. Well, his last football game was when he was like 34 years old. Like, there's 50 years of his life that nobody pays attention to, whether it's with, his broadcasting career, his wife, his honors or whatever. Like, they just gloss over that in like 5 pages. And, like, well, the dude was a broadcasting pioneer. He was the first ex-player to go into broadcasting. He did it starting in the 30s. Like, I was amazed of how much he was doing that early, even in the 30s and 40s, whether it was radio or print. And then obviously he did television too. So there was a little bit more in depth than that. And the same thing with his wife. I was happy to find the information and the research about his wife, because all the previous written stuff said, oh, she was a stewardess. He met her on a plane and they got married. And it's like, well, they were married, first of all, 49 years. So it wasn't like he just met her, when he was 60 years old and he met a stewardess, which was what's the interpretation, what it sounded like. And then I found out she was much more intelligent, much more well-rounded. Like, she graduated high school, she graduated college to get her teaching degree. She went to nursing school. She was a graduate of nursing school. And you had to be a nurse to be a stewardess back in the 40s. You just couldn't just be a steward. You had to be a registered nurse. So she wanted to see the world. And so she was much more intelligent. And the payoff was when Red passed away in Wheaton High School, she was sort of adopted Wheaton High School, as sort of, because since Red had passed away. So those type of things, the relationship with that high school at the end, like all that stuff I wrote about, most people would have just glossed over. And so that's the reason why it meant a lot to me to be as detailed, because it told as well around the story as you could about, he's such a great player and such a great person. Like, he deserved, I think, that sort of full scale biography that I see with a lot of the other sports and other sports grades. So if I'm going to sit there and read 550 pages of Babe Ruth, I know somebody would want to read 500 pages on Red Grange.
Well, you absolutely did him right. There's no question about that. But I know that Greg is dying to get to the NFL films portion of the program. So.
Oh, we're almost there. I was in talking about, I'll admittedly, I've not read all your books, but I've read most of them. But the one book I have not read is the book on the 49ers. How did that come to be?
Yeah, that one is my, that's like the bad sock in your sock drawer, or the one sock in your sock drawer that doesn't belong there. Because most of my projects are all, from the 20s, they're all early pro football. But at that point, I had just finished the Dutch book. So Dutch was the fourth book. So I wanted a little break from looking at microfilm. Now, back when I started, I still had to go look at stuff on microfilm and newspaper recaps and stuff like that. Newspaper.com has made it much easier to do now.
Oh, hey, that's a great plug too for the Sports History Network.
Yeah, so newspapers.com is a huge resource. It's like the best money I spend all year. Yeah. So I wanted a little bit of break for that. And what I wanted to do, it was a couple things. One was I wanted to do a project based on interviews. Like I loved some of the early projects, but I was getting a lot of, you would get a son or a grandson, you get the second level instead of the first level of participants, So the Niner book was, because that's my favorite franchise. Like, even though I grew up in Ohio, Montana and Rice are my two favorite players. 81 was the catch, was like my first big memory of loving, my favorite player, sort of with the favorite moment and seeing him win that, the catch in the Super Bowl. So I wanted to do something 84 Niners, and that was the 30th anniversary was coming up for that team, in 2014. So we plugged that anniversary with the book, and what I did was, because I wanted to interview, so I contacted the Niners and Keena Turner first to see if I would get some cooperation. And he helped me a lot of reaching out to some players. And then I did all the legwork myself. He's just mentioned. And so I interviewed pretty much like 30 of the players, almost all the coaches. Obviously, Walsh had passed away. So that was the challenge, was like, I wanted to write a book that was based on interviews, because there was another, it's not a football book, but I'll plug this. Wayne Coffey wrote a book on the 1980 U.S. hockey team that won the Olympics, the greatest upset in sports, Do You Believe in Miracles? And I thought he did a really good job of interviewing those guys and weaving the story of their backstory to what happened in the 1980 Olympics and then what they are doing today and stuff. Now, I didn't do as much with the where are they now type of thing, but I liked the way he read it. Like I said, I'm not a big hockey fan, but that's one sort of non-football books that I enjoyed reading. It was like, wow, this is really done really well. And it was mainly because those guys told the story. Those guys, the hockey guys, whether it was Jim Craig or Mike Ruzioni, Johnson, they told the story. And I thought, I hopefully if you read the 84 Niner book that you get that sense, because the guys are telling the story. Obviously I didn't get like Montana and lots of the two bigger names, but I got pretty much a lot of the roster to talk about what that season meant. So like I said, that's the one, dark sock in the white, white sock drawer. It's like, wow, he wrote a book on the 84 Niners and then doesn't look like all the other books, which I might not even go back to that era. I might just stay. I call it the Stone Age. I might just stay in the Stone Age and continue the 20s and 30s. But I enjoyed, sort of putting that book together.
We love the Stone Age, though. I mean, we really do.
Thank you.
Canvas pants are great.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. Oh, sorry, but that's
I was going to say the best part about the Stone Age is a lot of that Stone Age is Chicago football history too. Which you were saying. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I to cap that off is, I mean, I love today's, but you can watch Joe Montana highlights. You can watch, Jerry Rice highlights. on YouTube, you can go on the internet and you can watch hundreds of. Well, you're not going to be able to watch Red Grange and Bronko Nagurski and Dutch Clark a lot. You can barely find articles. So that's why I pursue those projects, because I want to preserve that part of that history, which leads into NFL films and being able to preserve that type of history. But that's how the Niner thing came about. So.
Right. Well, before we get to NFL films, let's talk about the book you are working on now about Bronko Nagurski. And that's what I was saying. A lot of that Stone Age football history is Chicago football history, whether it's on the north side or on the south side, though people here don't even realize that the Cardinals, that the NFL really more or less kind of started in Chicago. Yeah. And I know you're from Ohio, and that's like, to me, it's my heart says, hey, Chicago pro football started in Chicago, but we also know it started in Ohio too. But let's talk about Bronko Nagurski. How are things coming along, and what's that research and writing process been like?
Yeah, it's been tremendous. Bronko actually came out from the Grange book. Tony Nagurski, oldest son of Bronko, still living, 70 years old. He's 80 years old. I cut him short. And he always wanted to preserve his father's history in a book. There was one book written earlier by Jim Dent that he liked, but it rehashed a lot of the same stories. The plow story, him running into Wrigley Field wall, like it was all the same sort of stories. So he actually reached out to me of maybe doing a project. I had interviewed him for the Red Grange book, so I had a little bit of contact with him. And so I thought about it. I'm like, oh, okay, let me see, do I want to write about Bronko? Is this, I just finished Grange, which is, similar time period. So we talked about it, and the more he sort of told me, the research he had and the cooperation I would give. And he actually literally, I think it was like 2.5 weeks before COVID hit in New Jersey, he actually came out to NFL Films to talk to me, and we talked a little bit more. And then, once we started talking and we agreed, like, oh, we were on the same page, then I wanted to do it, because I'm always looking for this type of material. Like, he had letters from George Hallis, and he had some scrapbooks that the family kept. His siblings were still living and stuff. So I was like, this is a perfect situation. If I, wanted to do this, then this is what I would, this type of stuff, so that's how it came about. It's the manuscript's coming along. It's due in October of 2021. So like a couple months to get it really in shape. I'm probably about 75% through it now. So I'm looking forward to like finishing it, getting it to, because I think it's not going to be super in depth like Grange, just because Grange was a different animal. Like there's a lot more, Nagurski was a little bit more low profile. He didn't do Hollywood. He didn't do advertising. He sort of kept himself, although he was an NFL player and a pro wrestler, world champion. So it's scheduled to come out, this time next year. So we're getting close to like turning it in and to be able to get it out there. So we can read it, especially Bears fans, want to read a little bit more about those early years. And about Bronko. Bronko's story is definitely much different than Red's. And it's, like I said, it's part of that Stone Age that has a little bit more, teeth to it. So I'm looking forward to get out there.
And wasn't he born in Canada and moved to like Minnesota when he was little?
Yeah. Yes, he was born in a town called Rainy River, which is right across the border. And his dad was working in the mills there. And then there's, so he lived his first probably 8 years. And then some of the mills burnt down. So the town almost like was lost to these, because everybody worked at the mills there, whether it was lumber, and so his father moved the family across the border from Canada to International Falls, which is right there, to border. And so technically, I think there's only a few guys. Maybe the only one. He's the only one born in Canada that's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. but yeah, that's where his journey started, was in a little town named Rainy River. And the family, Tony, actually has been to that house. The house that he was born in and grew up in is still there. I wasn't able to visit it, because of COVID. But he sent me a photo of them outside the house. So the house there, that he was born in Rainy River is still actually there. You could go visit it, and so.
And you were in. I know you and I talked. I mean, I think correct me, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think you made a couple trips out here to interview people, at least in Chicago, correct? Or am I mistaken?
For Red,
for Nagurski.
Bronko. No,
for Bronko.
I wasn't able to travel much for Nagurski.
Oh, okay.
So for Red, I did. I went to Chicago and interviewed one of his nieces, and like I said, Tony Nagurski had a home outside of Illinois. He lives in Arizona mainly.
Okay.
So for Red, I did. I was in Chicago and Wheaton and University of Illinois. I went there a couple of times. For Bronko, it was a little unfortunate that I didn't do as much traveling because of COVID. It's just almost impossible to do. And then like everybody else, you're just trying to take care of yourself.
Right. Right.
Until now, like now I can travel and I feel okay traveling, but it's a little too late for that.
Well, and it's I think a lot of people who listen to this show, and hopefully we're as each episode comes out, we're getting more listeners, would be surprised to know that Bronko Nagurski is from Canada originally.
Yeah.
So and I guess from there, you're working on your books, but obviously you got a full-time job at NFL Films. And if you could tell me how that came to be, how did you come to work for NFL Films?
It's an interesting story. I mean, I was fortunate to give you the sort of condensed version. I was a physical education major in college, at a small school, Urbana University in southwest Ohio. Played football there, thinking I was going to be a coach. Growing up, around high state football, I was like, oh man, coaching at High State, Big Ten football would be the greatest thing. So I thought I was going to go into coaching. So in my senior year in college, I looked at grad programs, maybe be a grad assistant and just learn more and more. And Ohio State was like on my radar, and Ohio State had a grad program in sports history. And I was just like, what is that? That sounds awesome. And so I applied for sports history, which was in the physical education department with like sports management, sports philosophy, sports movement. So they had like 2 people graduating. So I was fortunate to get in that program. And then after a year, I wanted to do an internship. And this was even when I was in undergraduate, I applied to NFL Films and like the Hall of Fame and all the NFL teams to see if I could do an internship. And then after like 2+ years, NFL Films finally got back to me in the spring of '95 and said, if you want to do an interview. And so I went out there and did an interview, and they gave me the internship to get college credit to, in the fall of '95. They say, oh, if you come in the fall, that's the best time. Because I was going to think about doing it in the summer, but there's no games. It's like, if you come in the fall, you can be a fall intern and you have the games, and it's a lot better experience. So my professor was okay with that. So I went out there, and for the entire fall of '95, I worked as an intern in the archives department, just doing research. I thought that was my strength. I wasn't a film or TV major. So I didn't want to spend 3 months learning a flatbed or a video machine, and then my internship's up, and then I barely learned how to use the machine. So they just put me in research, and like I said, we have a great building, we have a great group of people, and nobody told me like, this is what you need to do, or you were doing a good job, but they noticed the work you were doing. And unfortunately, a few of the guys thought I was doing a good job, and they put my name in for a job. They were going to start a research library that was going to be part tape and part print, and because they were moving to more tapes, and being more digital at the time, and they just thought I would be perfect for it. And so I stayed, like through the Super Bowl it was through Super Bowl 30, and they offered me the full-time job. And I was like, well, this is what I want to do. This is why I went to grad school, was to, I thought I would end up at maybe the Pro Football Hall of Fame, doing, some type of archival work or research or writing, or if anything, I could taught sports history, but this was just such a great opportunity. I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this job. My parents were fine. They're like, I think this is what you want to do. And like I said, that was 25 years ago. And it's just, like I said, I was just fortunate to be, I think, in the right place, right time. And, being a hard worker, I think, paid off. So, which helped because I was from out of town. So all I did was stay there and do work. So it was like really cool to experience that. And like I said, it just was fortunate, that I was in the right place at the right time with the opportunity. So it was awesome.
And what was Steve Sabol like? What was Ed Sabol like? I've heard, I've watched all the documentaries. I've heard, I think, every interview that I could ever find on both of the Sabols. And it's first of all, talking to somebody who knew both of them personally is tell me about them. And they seem like wonderful, truly wonderful people.
No, like I said, I appreciate that. Like, they're the two best people that ever worked for. I was right at the end of Ed's run. Ed had just retired in 95, 96. But his presence was still there, like he would pop in the building. Although he retired in Arizona, he would come back every once in a while. And whether it was, an event, or he would come in just to see Steve, and his presence was there. And he was just, you could see where Steve got all his, his leadership ability, his likability, his personality. They were, although they were, like I said, you've seen them a lot. They were father and son, but they were really like best friends. They were buddies, and it was just tremendous to see. And like I said, just experience what Ed and just what he had to say. And then Steve's just a different animal. I don't know anybody that I've worked. Like I said, I've been there 25 years, and his door was always open. Like, you would think somebody that as much as he accomplished, or at the stage he was, like, here's a guy who was established, and he was the president of NFL Films. He was still the face, that he would not be the day-to-day nut and bolts, but he was there every day. He took one vacation a year, which was like around July 4th, which was like right before training camp, which was like the dead period in the NFL, is like July 4th, and that week. And his door was always open. So if you wanted to talk football, movies, whatever, you could just say hello and you could talk to him. I don't know how many times, hear me, I'm just guy that runs the research library. He would stop by my office, stop by the library, and just say, hey, what are you working on, Chris? What do you need? Like, he would say, he would want to give you all the tools that you needed to be successful. And it was like, you couldn't ask for that from the top. Like, he's the biggest guy in the building, and he's the biggest name, and he's the biggest, and him to come to you and say, what do you need? You need, do I need boxes for my magazines? Like, that would be something I could talk to him about. And he's like, I'll get you what you want, Chris. You need, you need this for your library. You need this for research. I mean, hey, I know, like, when I started the library, I was like, hey, is it okay to have a small budget to go buy books? Like, every year there's, maybe 10 books, 8 to 10 books that might come out or the new previews. Like, that's what you need, Chris, go get it. And then, we'll worry about, the cost or whatever later, so I could, like, the 3 best football books come out, like, we need them. Like, we need to, as much as the internet's great now, like, we still have that philosophy. Say, hey, Chris, if you need something, the internet's great. You can find a lot of stuff. There's a lot of football material that's not on the internet. You need a biography. You need a biography like those pass, punt, and kick books. They're not. You can't read those on the internet. You can't read them on your iPad. But they're great resources, and we need them. And we're doing, especially like when we did the NFL 100 or Peyton's Places now. You want the research. You want certain things, that maybe is not available on the internet or that you can read on your iPad and stuff. So Steve, I'll tell one quick story that I love about Steve, that just like means the most to me, it's like means so much. The second or third year, working in the building. So I'm just getting started. I don't know if he knows me from anybody, but he knows, I'm a big history guy, and he loves, and we have a card show out here. It's called the Philly Card Show. It used to be in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, but now it's in King of Prussia area. And it's a huge card show. And Steve, I heard about it. Like, I would read it in Sports Collector's Digest, if you ever read that back in the day. Mm-hmm. And the shows, like, oh, there's this Philly show that's supposed to be pretty good. And so I started going there, but I didn't have a car my first couple of years out. I would just ride my bike or go to work. I said when I was interning, I was expecting to go back to grad school, but then I was like, okay, I got to save up for a car. And so Steve, one day said, hey, are you going to the card show this weekend? And I was like, oh yeah, I was thinking about it, but I don't have a ride. And he was like, oh, that's okay. I'm going Sunday. If you want to come, being in Morristown, which is the same area I was in where my apartment was. He was like, no, I'll come by and pick you up and we'll go. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And so here we were on Sunday afternoon. We would go. He picked me up. We drove out to Fort Washington, 40-minute drive, and we walked around. Then he went his way. He was big into tickets and things that he liked. And I went, and we went and we came home. And I was like, for a president of a company of NFL Films, or a president of any company, to just take some random work just to a card show. And he'd give me a ride. It wasn't like we went there and met. Like, he gave me a ride, picked me up. And I just thought that was just awesome. Like I said, he went beyond what a normal boss would be, and to help you do your job. And like I said, he's just, like I said, there's not too many, like I said, I can talk so many kind words about what Steve did. And like I said, and I'm not the only one. It's like that throughout the building. Almost every guy and girl that probably worked there has a Steve story, right. Especially, so it's, he's just tremendous to be around.
He touched so many lives. Really all of us, I think. And not only you work directly for him, but me, Scott, everybody I think that watches, who loves pro football, obviously has been impacted by their work, by your work now. But, I know you guys are hard at work. It's NFL Films, and I'm in a film class actually right now, and I keep bringing NFL Films. I don't think the instructor really likes it too much when I bring NFL Films up, but I'm always, when it comes to the art of storytelling, I always bring up Steve Sabol and NFL Films, because they've created the modern game, and you're part of that, and that's cool. You are, a part of history as we move forward. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it when I'm traveling, or if you're in different projects, or you meet people and they hear that and they say, oh, you work for NFL, do you know Steve, or do you know? It's still, like I said, I'm so appreciative of people that still respond to what we do, or they grew up with it, because I did the same thing, like in the 70s and 80s, I grew up watching NFL Films, and 2 a.m. I'm trying to find it, on the weekend or whatever, or any shows that they did, or you buy the VHS, tapes back in the day, some of your younger listeners probably won't know what VHS is, but, right. Though it's still really nice to hear how people respond and grew up with that, or grew up with Steve, grew up with the shows, or that's how they became fans, or they became bigger, or they became a fan of a player. Like, oh man, I love Deacon Jones because of that piece. He talked about sacking quarterbacks, and that's just, like I said, it's just one, preserving history. It's promoting history. It's, like I said, it's educating. Right. It's getting it out there, and it's so nice to hear. Like I said, you and Scott, like I said, you grew up with that and you love that, and like I said, it just makes your passion, or your love for football that much greater because of what NFL Films has done. Get you closer to the game, get you closer to your favorite team, your favorite player, and like I said, that's the ultimate compliment.
Well, you do it with such artistry.
Yeah,
and you have from the outset. There's never ever been a decline in quality. It's fantastic. I can't, and I know Greg feels the same way when it comes to your appreciation of the NFL. You can't imagine that appreciation without NFL Films. You really can't.
Yeah.
Now there's a certain generation that's their feeling. Like, wow, and hopefully we can keep doing that, with the younger generation, like, wow, I want to watch NFL films, or this is the standard, especially for NFL and pro football, this is the standard that is set, and to be able to enjoy and stuff. So, and that starts with Steve. He passed away in 2012, so next year will be 10 years. And his presence is still there. There's a lot of guys that is around that he hired and that has worked for him, that we want to continue it. We want to pass that down to the younger producers. Look, this is the way you do it. This is the way we want to tell stories. This is the way we do music. We want you to feel. We want the emotion. The poetry, or the way we shoot the games instead of the poetry. Like I said, you still want that to go, because there's definitely different avenues now. You can, whether social media or the internet or TV or whatever, there's so many things that can be watched. You still want it to look like NFL films. You still want some type of reaction. It just doesn't need to be some 5-second clip that everybody watches and then just goes on to the next one and the next one.
Right.
You want people to feel, because then they keep coming back. Then you want them to come back. You want them.
Well, I mean, talking about, things that make you keep coming back, and, and I know he was long gone before you got there, but, John Facenda, the voice. And I was actually telling a guy I was in the Navy with, and man, without John Facenda, without Steve Sabol, I don't think I would have the love of poetry that I do. And when I pass away, there's going to be one poem spoken at my funeral, and that's going to be The Autumn Wind, because it just, as a kid, it infused that just love of words. And have you guys, and without, have you guys found a good replacement for John Facenda yet? Because that's a hard one. That's been a hard one. That's been a hard one to replace.
Yeah, I mean, he's another one. I mean, he passed away in 1984. I mean, that's
right,
30 something years. I mean, and I think most people still associate his name with our films, although he hasn't done a film in 30 something years, but that was part of Steve's genius. And Ed, like, they could see what he could do and what he might, and what he might do for their films and their storytelling. And like I said, give them all the credit to say they could see that, and then, and have him, sort of be the voice, sort of the NFL. He still is, like I said,
And I love
you would think somebody
either
would have passed him. Yeah. I mean, that's another one. I mean, so it still amazes me that people like whether it's Steve or John, those are like the first two names that come out, and then Steve and Ed, and then John's the next name that comes out of what NFL Films is about, and it should be that way. He's still the voice of God, and he still, like I say, he still resonates, with fans and our shows. So it's part of the NFL Films, like I said, it's part of the lore and the special, sort of era that they went through that still, like I said, continues today.
Yeah, and plus the music too. I mean, I've got, I have that 10-volume CD of all the music from that era. It, when I had to explain that one to my wife when it came in, I go, and it's funny. My wife hates football, but she loves that Sam Spence music from that era. So it's timeless.
It's also great to hum to yourself when you're doing yard work, I've learned.
Yeah. Well, guys, hey, we are approaching here. I think we've been going well over an hour, and I know, Chris, you've got we both all have things to do tonight. It's evening, and hey, Chris, how can people find you? I know you're on Twitter. Do you have a website? Do you how can people reach you?
No, I'm just on Twitter. That's it. So
and then if looking to buy a book, just type in Chris Willis in Google, and
yeah, you can. It's on Amazon. I mean, all of them are on Amazon. If you want to go that route. ROWMAN, Rowan.com is the publisher. It's Rowan and Littlefield, but it's Rowan.com. So if you want to go the route of just publisher, all of them are on there, so either way you can find them on those sites. So
right. Or if Chris is having a signing, as I found out the hard way, do buy your book at the bookstore where he's having the signing. The bookstore owner out in Downers Grove still a little ticked off at me for bringing a book from Amazon.
BYOB had an entirely different meaning there.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Well, Chris, hey, hang tight. We're going to talk to you after we get offline here. But hey, thank you much for joining us, and I'd like to do this again soon. Hopefully, after the book. Well, obviously, the book's going to be coming out here within the year. So, have you back on?
Absolutely. No, I appreciate the time. Appreciate the invite. Like I said, you guys are awesome, and this is it was fun to talk a little bit of football history.
All right.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Thanks a lot. It's like I always say, it's an honor talking to you, and I can't wait for neither one of us can wait for the book to come out, and when we have you back on, we'll go knee deep in Bronko Nagurski and Chicago Bears football.
Absolutely. So keep up the good work.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot, Chris. And hey, everybody, thanks for listening.
We met, it seems, so long ago that autumn day, ablaze with red and gold and yellow. It was the first you had met me, the game. But oh, how you played for such a little fellow. And as you grew, your dreams grew too. The roaring crowds were a part of you. And then came that gleaming sunlit day when college halls and ivied walls were finally left behind. By then, we'd been friends for many years, so you turned to me to find a way. And there were things I demanded from you. For in that summer sun furnace, you worked as you had never worked before. The steel in you lifted, strained and melted, and through it all, you swore. You fell to earth and rose again to battle emotionless machines. You knew that this had played no part in those long-gone boyhood dreams. Finally, there came that September day you raced out to claim the glory you thought you had earned. And how you railed at me when I said, there's still a lot more to learn. While some learned instinct and reaction, still others learned to be men. And every time they knocked you down, you got back up again. I taught you discipline and working with others on your teams. And you admit it with an embarrassed smile. It's not as easy as it seems. But slowly you learned the uses of that body we had trained. You learned to fake and swivel and throw and go for the extra effort game. I made you pay for the dreams you had dreamed over the many years. I exacted a toll that you had to pay in blood and sweat and tears. I took the measure of your soul, the measure of your heart, as you went crashing, thrashing down, or head on where walls wouldn't part. I stole victory from your fingers' reach, by margins so slim, it was a pity. And often because of capricious whim, I stole your dignity. Yes, I demanded much from you, but I gave much in return. I gave you a chance to catch and run with wings upon your feet, a place to stampede and revel in the feeling that you couldn't be beat. I gave you a showcase for your grace. A place where the wind brushed against your face. A place where a leap or a flick of your hand caused a gasp and roar from the crowd. A place where in victory or defeat, your emotions were allowed. A place where in victory or defeat, you held your head up proud. I gave you a place where men like yourself battled toward the same ends. Men who fought others with the same gut toughness and walked from the field as friends. And I think in the end, I made you a better man, no matter what your name. And I know in the end that you made me a bigger and better game.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.